Hello everyone! The next several parts of this series are going to be about Happy Wheels speedrunning. But before I get into that matter, you may be wondering, why even speedrun Happy Wheels? What's so great about it? Can it really be as interesting as those more popular games, Mario and Minecraft? So I've decided to dedicate this entire video to identifying the qualities of Happy Wheels that make it uniquely qualified as an excellent speedrunning game, in my opinion. Please enjoy. One of the most important aspects of a speedrunning game is that the game has a high skill ceiling. There should be some techniques that are genuinely difficult to pull off, and that you wouldn't see in most casual playthroughs. The gameplay should be complex enough that it's possible to combine actions in innovative ways to get through levels more quickly than would normally be possible. This often involves exploiting glitches and taking advantage of the mechanics of the game to skip past portions of a level in ways that the developers did not intend to be possible. In this way, highly skilled players who can integrate multiple difficult tricks into their runs will be able to beat a game much more quickly than the average player. This allows for meaningful competition to arise in a gaming community. Players strive to discover new optimizations that they can implement, and to get more optimal runs that set them ahead of the competition. A player may be able to explain all of the major time saves in a game, but it's a different matter entirely to be able to integrate every one of those time saves into a single run. Doing that requires a lot of skill and memorization, which are developed through practice. If a game's gameplay is so simple that any moderately skilled player can achieve a near-record run with little difficulty, that's not going to make for a very interesting competition. There's good reason why auto-runner games rarely develop large and competitive speedrunning communities. Their gameplay is too simple for highly complex strategies to emerge. The player only has access to a small number of actions, such as jumping and punching, and it's usually not possible to skip past major portions of a level, or to achieve a speed that's significantly faster than the character's default running speed. In an auto-runner game, a speedrun is barely distinguishable from a normal, casual playthrough. It probably just has fewer level restarts. Happy Wheels has one of the highest skill ceilings of any game that I've ever played. The controls are easy enough to learn, but extremely difficult to master. There are many different ways that the player can make a playthrough shorter, using increasingly complex inputs. Something as simple as accelerating to full speed offers a great wealth of possible strategies. In most platformers, speeding up is pretty easy. You just have to run on a flat surface for a little over a second. There's no complex input required. You just hold right and the run button. Just like that, you've reached the fastest possible speed in the game. There's no option to consider speedrunning strategies that would require the character to go more quickly. In Happy Wheels, each character's default riding speed is not the cap. It's possible to go much more quickly through various methods. With your responsible dad, it's possible to ride up on the front wheel and quickly alternate between leaning forward and leaning backward. This strategy allows the vehicle to achieve a greater speed, and it's especially useful in scaling steep inclines quickly. Every character can gain speed by jumping off of a mine or by taking a hit from a wrecking ball. These are high-risk strategies. Either of these hazards can easily kill the character if you hit them at the wrong angle. And being highly skilled at the controls of Happy Wheels doesn't only mean that you can complete levels more quickly. We're going to see more of this when I get around to talking about full game runs, but some speedrunners will actually use a strategy that's slower than the individual level record strategy, but that's more consistent and easier to set up if the runner knows how to pull off a specific maneuver. In the level Super Mario 64, it's possible to bound over a large portion of the level and go straight to the end by using Irresponsible Dad's wobbling exploit to stay in the air. Under most circumstances, the bicycle has to be going very quickly for this to work, and this moving shape has to hit the wheels from below at just the right time to impart the correct upward impulse. This strategy is very difficult to time, and it has a low success rate. However, there's an easier setup that some highly skilled runners, including Ewan111, have been able to pull off. Ewan stops in front of the moving shape, and he waits for it to get into exactly the required position. Then he starts wobbling as one would normally do, but he presses the buttons much more quickly than most players would. By wobbling more quickly in the air, he's able to travel farther before the bicycle falls down, and to compensate for the speed that he lost by stopping the bicycle. Most runners wouldn't be able to pull this off. They simply don't know how to press left and right quickly enough with Ewan's very precise timing. He's clearly practiced this trick extensively. But once he knows how to do it, Ewan is able to pull off this strategy more consistently than he would be able to time the wobbling without having waited. In longer runs of several levels, skilled runners will often go for a slightly slower strategy that they are able to pull off consistently. Knowing when to do this is an important skill. This game's unique ragdoll physics increase the range of possible speedrunning strategies. The objects of the levels interact with the character in very complex ways that you wouldn't see in most games. In most games, each object that exists can interact in a narrow subset of ways, which are based on what the object is supposed to represent in the context of the game. In a Kirby game, some objects are defined as enemies. They may spawn projectiles. If Kirby intersects with the hitbox of an enemy or a projectile, he will take a certain predetermined increment of damage. It doesn't matter where it touched him or for how long. If the game detects that Kirby has taken damage, his interactions with enemies will completely change for a brief moment. Instead of being pushed backward and taking damage, he will be able to run right through the enemy. If Kirby takes a certain amount of damage without replenishing health, he will instantly die and have to respawn. Enemies can be completely destroyed to the point that they no longer interact with the game world in any way, but they may respawn. All of these interactions are very clearly defined based on what enemies are supposed to represent, and for that reason, they're predictable. Enemies only have the qualities that are associated with the object class of enemies. You would never expect a broom hatter to behave in a manner similarly to a block or a key. Those are completely different classes of objects. You can't walk on an enemy or pick it up and carry it around. Happy Wheels is different from Kirby and similar games because the game contains far fewer classes of objects, and because physical properties differ less between classes. Every interactable object in the game is made of one or more fundamental units called shapes. Different shapes interact slightly differently. Some shapes like body parts or trash cans or glass can be broken or dented or shattered. Meanwhile, rectangles stay rigid. But all of these shapes share some important physical properties in common. They all fall at the same speed. They all exert the same weight per unit area if their density is set to the default value. Level designers are able to invent extremely complex mechanisms within their levels. These mechanisms may have detailed art, and they may represent entities like bosses, which aren't supported natively in the game's design tools, as a discrete object class. A group of objects in a level may look like a huge fucking elephant that's coming to slaughter you, but as far as the game's engine is concerned, it's just a group of rectangles and other shapes. Its physical properties are not unlike those of the buildings and the street below you. The only reason why these particular shapes have such a tendency to kill the character is because they move with a great amount of force, and when they collide with the character, they tend to force the body parts apart. None of the interactions in Happy Wheels are determined on a simple basis that translates a cause directly to an outcome. There's no protocol in the game's programming that states, when the elephant collides with the player character, the character dies. The actual outcome is far more complex and more difficult to predict. It's highly dependent on the specific conditions of the collision. Because the engine recognizes the elephant's moving parts as non-fixed shapes, I can interact with them in all of the ways that would be associated with non-fixed shapes. I can actually grab onto the elephant and hitch a ride for a while. See how well that works for you. I can push off of the shapes with the vehicle's wheels. By using unintentional properties of fixtures in the game, which are inherited from the fundamental units of the shapes, it is possible to open up a wide range of speedrunning strategies, some more obvious than others. The possibilities are more restricted in most games, in which objects are designed to only have the properties associated with their specific functions within the context of the game. Depending on where on the body you take a collision, the outcome can be vastly different. In most games, this barely matters. Kirby can take a hit from a cutter on his foot or on top of his head. In both cases, he suffers the same increment of damage and the same distance of knockback. In Happy Wheels, the area of impact matters greatly. A strong impact to the head is usually an instant kill, but a helmet can often save you. A hit to the abdomen usually doesn't leave any lasting effect, unless if it's powerful enough to completely split the body apart. You can walk away from a spear to the abdomen completely unharmed. If a certain number of your arms and legs break, you may be left alive but completely unable to control your vehicle. This is a really cool feature. It adds a level of realism to the game, and makes it so that runners are extra cautious about how they take damage, and it makes them want to avoid damage when it doesn't offer any advantage. In most games, damage is generally understood to be bad and detrimental to a fast run, but you can still be pretty nonchalant about it. It doesn't affect gameplay too much. Kirby with 1/4 health is generally as fast and as powerful as Kirby with full health. It's only if you get down to 0 health and you have to respawn that an increment of damage causes a major time loss of more than a second. But in Happy Wheels, damage has a direct effect on how the character handles. Breaking your legs does make your character slower and make their jumps shorter. A difference in placement of a few pixels and a fraction of a second can make the difference between a collision that kills you instantly and one that lets you off with minor injuries. This unique take on damage makes the game a lot more complex and more interesting in my opinion. To go further with the game's unique ragdoll physics, the game accounts for the angle of the vehicle in unique and interesting ways. In most 2D games, the engine always assumes that the bottom surface of the character is perfectly flat and level when it collides with any platform, even if that collision is implausible. Look at this! I'm standing with like 2 pixels of my 1 foot, and I'm not falling forward, somehow. In Happy Wheels, most vehicles are allowed to rotate along a full 360-degree axis. The engine considers both the angle and the position of the vehicle when calculating the outcome of a collision. This makes collisions more realistic and allows the player more control of how the vehicle moves. It's possible to avoid damage from a high fall by positioning in such a way that the wheels absorb most of the impact. One can make extremely tight turns to weave around obstacles. One can reduce the amount of speed that the vehicle loses from hitting a shape by making the contact as small and as brief as possible. There is an even wider potential for different outcomes of collisions when powerful moving shapes are involved. Getting back to the example of the wrecking ball, the outcome will differ greatly depending on the precise positioning and angle of the vehicle. The ball acts as a very large, dense, and fast-moving shape. It exerts a force on the player character. If most of that force is exerted on the body, it will push the body parts apart and kill the character. If it is exerted mostly on the vehicle, this will have the major effect of sending the vehicle flying through the air. If it hits at one specific angle, it may send the vehicle nearly to the very end of the level, proving very beneficial to a fast speedrun. At a slightly different angle, it may send the vehicle more high up rather than forward. This may still be useful, but at once a less optimal outcome. These outcomes may look impossibly difficult to control, but skilled speedrunners have gotten very good at consistently positioning the characters to set up skips like these, utilizing the shapes in a level. This is another area in which the richness of the controls and the mechanics open up a wide array of possibilities for a skilled player who knows how to utilize them. Because of the game's high skill ceiling and its unique physics, Happy Wheels offers a tremendous potential for improved strategies and discovery of new optimizations.
Just look at the replay browser on some of the most popular levels. People are still setting new records, even after these levels have received tens of millions of plays over the course of a decade.
On some of the longer levels, the difference between the record time in 2020 and the record a few years earlier can be as much as a full second. It's only in the past few months that the rate of new records has slowed down significantly. The popularity of Happy Wheels has waned somewhat since the death of Flash.
There's always the potential that a player will discover a new shortcut or a new way to get launched off of a hazard and to land near the end of the level. Compare this to a game that has much simpler physics and much less room for new optimizations to be discovered. Super Mario Bros. Released 36 years ago, and players have been deconstructing it ever since. Some skilled speedrunners know every detail of this game's collisions, down to the sub-pixel. They know the optimal route to the end of the game, which requires that Mario passes through the fewest possible levels and moves over the shortest possible horizontal distance. Every major speedrunning strategy that is currently used in the any percent category has been known for at least 3 years. I think that the most recently discovered optimization is an RTA viable flagpole glitch that saves a frame rule in 8.1. Stuck in a Plate implemented this time save in 2018, and speedrunners including Cosmic have used slight variations of his method, some using a power star to manipulate subpixel values. The overall strategy is to run to the right of the screen for almost the entire run, only slowing down in a few places to set up wall jumps, flagpole glitches, wrong warps, and other time-saving tricks. There isn't much else that you can actually do to save time. Mario still has to pass over a large distance to get to the end. For the past several years, this category has been a competition to see who can fit the most possible optimizations into any single run. Very few new optimizations have been discovered, and the competition has lasted this long because implementing any one of the major time saves is difficult on its own. In my opinion, the Super Mario Bros. Speedrunning of today is a lot less interesting than it was several years ago. Of course, it's great for the speedrunners who have put in a lot of effort to achieve these impressive runs, but I've kind of lost interest. Unless if some epic new time save is discovered, the record isn't going to go much lower. We're just going to keep seeing people reiterating the same strategies over and over. I like a game like Happy Wheels, which has more complex gameplay and more areas to find small time saves. While Happy Wheels speedrunning strategies are very rich and complex, they are still quite easy to follow from the viewer's perspective. In most levels, the objective is pretty simple. You simply have to get the player character to a certain area of the level to make the win banner appear. The banner may appear when the player touches a finish line, or a trigger, or a certain number of coins. Everything between start and finish is simply how we get to that point. A viewer may not be familiar with the exact series of inputs that the player is using to make the character move in a certain way. They may not know how to launch Segway Guy up out of his vehicle, or how to run over a mine without dying, or how to apparently make a bicycle fly through the air. But in all of those cases, they can understand what the movement of the character actually is. Conceptually, these are all simple and familiar actions. Nothing in a Happy Wheels speedrun looks like it should be impossible within the context of how the game's mechanics work. In a typical speedrun, there shouldn't be any moment in which a passingly informed viewer has no idea what the player is doing. Not all games are like this at all. Speedrunning is often criticized for being too esoteric and too difficult for new viewers to get into without doing a huge amount of research beforehand. Compare a Happy Wheels run with the current world record run in Donkey Kong 64 by Signa Kong. As awesome as this run is, it's almost completely incomprehensible to anyone who doesn't have a working knowledge of the game's internal processes. This runner uses so many complicated and confusing tricks. He exploits bugs in the game's collision detection to jump through walls. He walks under the floor. He accesses characters that shouldn't be unlocked within the context of the game's scenario. He turns invisible at one point. He stops and restarts the game at seemingly arbitrary times, but he's actually manipulating the values of timers that are running in the background of the game's programming. He appears to waste time waiting on selection screens at points. Sometimes the music or the composition of cutscenes seem to be out of place. I've watched several hours of videos explaining the strategies of this game, and I'm still a bit confused at points. Happy Wheels doesn't have nearly as many processes running in the background, and you don't have to know any specific details about how the game is programmed to understand the strategies. In most cases, what the speedrunner is trying to do is obvious from what is visible on screen and what makes sense within the level's scenario. Now, there are some Happy Wheels levels that include complex user-made vehicles that may act in unusual ways when inputs are entered in a specific way. Further, in some levels, it's possible to win by activating a trigger that exists off-screen. In runs of these levels, an uninitiated viewer may have difficulty following what is happening, but those few levels are definitely the exception to the rule, and I will be discussing a few of them in detail in future videos. There is no random number generation whatsoever in Happy Wheels, and I think that that's a desirable quality in a speedrunning game. Every movement of every shape in a level follows directly from the simulated physics of the game. A level starts in exactly the same state every time that you start it. The shapes all start in their assigned positions, and they move when acted upon by the player character or by any force that exists in the simulated world, such as gravity. If you lose time in a certain level, it's never because the game gave you an unfavorable seed. It's because you produced a series of inputs that was suboptimal. Jumping on a mine is a common trick that's used in many speedruns. If you land just right, the mine will launch you upward and you'll be able to go a long distance very quickly. But if your speed or your placement is just slightly off, the mine will kill you instantly. These outcomes aren't random. If you get good at positioning your mine jump, you can pull off this trick nearly every time. Whether you live or die depends on slight differences in your inputs. It's not something that the game is deciding outside of your control. The player is in full control. To pull off these difficult speedrunning tricks, it's simply a matter of getting good at the game and being able to produce very precise inputs. Every person who plays a level gets the same starting conditions. After that point, there may be some slight differences in how shapes react to forces because of how the game runs on different operating systems. But those differences are small in comparison to the random patterns that are generated in many other games. Through extensive practice, you can learn every single detail of a level, and you can learn that a certain trick that you can pull off will always result in a specific outcome if you do it correctly. Because the starting conditions are the same, the difference in time that runners can achieve is dependent entirely on how well each runner plays. You don't need any luck to set a new record in a Happy Wheels level. What you need are skill and precision. It's easy to take this quality for granted, but not all games are like this. A lot of games have a random number generator function that changes what items spawn and how enemies move. In those games, runners don't navigate exactly the same geometry with every run. Object placements change slightly between runs. It's not really possible to memorize every detail of a level if the details can change slightly and you don't know beforehand exactly what you're going to get. There's a bit of a luck factor mixed in with the skill. Some random patterns are more favorable than others, and you often see speedrunners resetting a run entirely just because they got an unfavorable random pattern that would have cost them a few seconds. For many years, the most common way for a game to generate numbers was to count the number of frames that have passed since the game system was turned on. In The Legend of Zelda, if you enter a dungeon on a specific frame, you'll see one pattern of enemy movement. If you enter just 4 frames earlier, you see a completely different pattern that may be less favorable. These patterns are considered to be random because there's no direct logical correlation between when Link enters a room and how the enemies should move. Their movement is based on a function of the game console itself that's almost entirely outside of the player's control, because it's extremely difficult to control for the frame on which Link enters the dungeon, given the limits of human precision. Some newer games are even more random than those old NES games, because they don't just use a simple frame counter. They may access the system's internal clock and use the time as a seed to generate patterns. Unless if you're somehow manipulating your system's clock, the precise time and date will be different with every single run, so you won't see exactly the same pattern in multiple runs, even if your inputs are exactly the same. Now, I want to draw a distinction between randomness and unpredictability. I'll admit that I've contributed somewhat to the continued confusion of these two terms, considering that I've literally released 2 Happy Wheels levels called Random Number Generator. Those levels aren't actually random, in the way that encounters in Pokemon are. The number that is released depends on the position of the bingo cage when it releases, which depends on when I activate the trigger at the bottom of the level. It's very difficult to control for the precise time when I get to the bottom of the level, because I have to navigate around all of these obstacles.
If I activate the trigger at a specific time, it may produce a result of 4.
But if I activate it 1 frame earlier or later, that may result in a different outcome. Until I try it, I don't know what the outcome will be for a specific series of inputs. For that reason, the outcome may appear to be random. But it's actually not. I have full control of the number that is produced. It depends entirely on the inputs that I produce once the level starts. The same set of inputs will always result in the same outcome, if reiterated on an accurate machine. It doesn't matter what time it is, or how many frames have elapsed since I opened the game. That's why replays are able to work. Now, I think that some RNG in a game is acceptable, but some games go way too far with it. For example, GoldenEye on the N64 is a game that has very rich gameplay in my opinion, but I never really got into it as a speedrunning game because the RNG turned me off. In this game, almost everything is randomized, from the death animations of enemies to the speeds of gates opening. On the mission Cradle, the current world record strategy requires that a grenade spawns under very specific circumstances to destroy a computer console and complete one of the mission's objectives without Bond having to shoot the console. Because of random number generation and the game's inconsistent frame rate, this trick has about a 1 in 250 chance of working on any given run, even if you do everything else perfectly. In my opinion, it's just not interesting to watch a runner grind the same short level hundreds of times just to get the favorable RNG. And I can't imagine that it's very fun for the player either. In GoldenEye, the player's skill is only one factor that determines whether or not the player will set a new record. On some missions, it's not even the major factor. So much is dependent on luck. This somewhat lessens the importance of records, in my opinion. When I see a record, I often think any player who is moderately skilled in GoldenEye could achieve that. They just have to get the right RNG. This record isn't really evidence that the player is especially skilled. It just means that he was willing to grind for all of the hours to get the right RNG. And I feel crappy for the fact that I think that way, because I know that these runners have dedicated a great amount of effort and ingenuity to develop these strategies, and then to actually pull them off. But I can't shake that feeling. If a game's strategies are so dependent on luck, that luck inevitably displaces some of the importance of skill and makes records seem less impressive in the eyes of some, including myself. I don't mean to say that randomization is completely worthless in speedrunning games. It has its place. People have their own reasons for speedrunning highly randomized games, and I respect them. I even watch some of those runs on occasion. For example, the random seed categories in Minecraft offer very unique challenges. In those categories, every single run is supposed to be in a completely different world. You can't know the fastest route to the end if you've never played the world before, and you can't know exactly where to go in the same way that a Mario speedrunner knows where to go after playing the same sequence of levels hundreds of times. Minecraft random seed speedrunning requires a very different set of skills in comparison to most games. The game rewards quick decision-making and willingness to take risks without knowing how they will pay off. That, in itself, is interesting. Of course, Minecraft is very different from Happy Wheels, and I wouldn't compare the two. Happy Wheels is much closer to a traditional speedrunning game, in which it's possible to memorize the geometry of the world through extensive practice, and to pull off complex tricks that work specifically because the level is designed in a certain way. For the type of game that Happy Wheels is, I think that it's for the best that the game is not randomized.
Thank you for listening to my explanations. Hopefully I've convinced a few of you of why Happy Wheels speedrunning is so interesting. My next video will cover the categories of speedrunning, with some history thrown in. Until then,